I'm joined today by Vera Loftis from Solution Junkies, which is a Salesforce partner and an incredible CRM agency. So thank you so much, Vera, for taking the time to meet with me. I'd love for you to tell our audience at home just a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I come from a long line of CRM companies and expertise. So I've been doing this in the Salesforce space for over a decade now. So me and the founding group of Solution Junkies were part of a company called Blue Wolf, which was the first Salesforce implementation partner. So really since kind of the inception of CRM and Salesforce and what has now become a growing kind of platform of technologies that connect customers to vendors and suppliers. And when I look at that evolution over the last few years, I think, particularly for customers who are embarking on this new kind of journey, it's quite overwhelming. And so our role is really to make sure that we're trying to educate as much as we are enable, and just help people really understand what all these acronyms mean, what this ecosystem looks like, how they start to really envision their business in these platforms and tools, and how they kind of maximize that investment without being completely overwhelmed in the process. So we like to think that we're this, shepherd that kind of sits between the customer and the big tech vendors to help them navigate what is becoming ever more confusing with AI and all of the new innovations and advancements.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned acronyms, because I can't tell you how often it is that I am talking about CRM, talking about all this stuff with a new client, and they're like, what's CRM? So maybe that's a really good place to start. What is CRM, Vera?
Yeah, great question. And it's funny, I think when you look at different industries, we work a lot in public sector and nonprofit, and you do realize that a lot of people are operating without a CRM. So CRM in its traditional sense is customer relationship management. But I think that's really confusing now when you think about these big CRM platforms being so much more than just CRM. So when somebody makes a purchasing decision for something like Salesforce, rarely are people buying it as this kind of isolated point solution for a CRM. They're really buying it for a customer engagement platform. And it almost feels like we need to evolve the acronym at some point over time, because it's not really about just managing, these interactions with our customers. It's about how do we capture engagement, and how do we make sure that we're giving everybody that we interact with a better experience through the use of technology, and not just kind of managing the nuts and bolts of our day-to-day activities.
So for CRMs, specifically for clinics, what would you say, or what would you think that a clinic owner should expect a CRM to do in its first year of implementation?
And I think it depends on why you're embarking on this journey. And we see people come, for different purposes and different visions. I think a lot of times when we initially get engaged with somebody who doesn't have a CRM system, it usually tends to be at the top of the funnel. And what I mean by that is, I've got a lot of kind of inbound. I'm trying to capture conversations and leads and convert those into something that's tangible in terms of, somebody's actually booked a session or has, paid an engagement. And so when I think about it from that perspective, if conversion is really the end kind of metric or goal, it's really looking at how do I make sure that every touch point at the beginning of that cycle is captured in a way that allows me to follow up, so that ultimately I'm gaining a higher conversion. So if I look at year one of having a CRM compared to last year, you would expect that my bookings rate would go up, my conversion rate would go up. So the number of people I'm talking to is now allowing me to capture more business on the back end, and that business is then yielding revenue.
And that's so important for everything that we do, because with obviously marketing, we want to track and measure every piece of that journey. Just like you said, all those touch points, if we can track it and feed that information, back to the algorithms, you're really starting to understand return on investment and, just exactly how successful the marketing journey is. So that's really great. So who would you say, people working in the clinic, who does the CRM serve most? Is it the owner, the clinician, or the receptionist?
Yeah.
Who and why?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think it serves everybody. I think typically the conversation starts with either a single individual or a single department. So we'll often embark in a conversation with an owner who wants more visibility of the data, wants more access to reporting, wants to be able to look at trend analysis, and that's kind of one angle, and that sets a very particular tone and vision around an implementation. Other times you'll see it come from the marketing department, and it will be down to exactly what you said, Taylor, which is we're investing in all of these marketing activities and functions, but we can't necessarily prove that it's giving us the return on investment. Anecdotally, it feels like it's working, but there's not kind of concrete evidence there that helps us trace that lead, from inception through to revenue. And so again, that colors an implementation in a very different way. But I would argue, regardless of kind of the initial motivation or the starting point, every organization should take a step back. So before embarking on this journey, looking at how does this system then impact every person who interacts with a patient? Because to your point about the clinician and the receptionist, I think oftentimes if you are coming at CRM from a very specific department or a very specific goal, you forget that actually this system should be for those roles as well. And so taking a step back to then look at the touch points across the entire customer lifecycle and who they're interacting with in those various touch points and how we make those people's lives easier is equally important to kind of capturing the marketing ROI or greater visibility in terms of reporting and data transformation. And so I think we take the receptionist as an example, right? Somebody comes in, you want to know, is this person the first time they've entered the office? Have they been coming to us for 10 years? Some of that you'll know by recognizing people's face, but it would be lovely if you knew that Bob has an appointment at 10 a.m. Bob walks through the door and in front of you, you've got Bob's entire history, right? And so I don't have to remember 100 people that come in and out of my waiting area. I've got some background that helps me create a really personal experience by just shooting up, some elements on the screen that give me indicators of past services that we've given Bob or preferences that Bob has. And so that tends to be a really, we call quick win, but something super tangible where the data that people are capturing across that life cycle, that receptionist has at their fingertips, and it makes that initial kind of entry and data entry component really super seamless and creates that level of personalization that we're all after.
That sounds major. I mean, that's so important to really improve patient experiences. I mean, that's a really kind of amazing thing to do, just to make every touch point just a little bit more personal, especially with long-term patients. That's amazing. So we work with clinics of all sizes. For the smaller kind of startup clinics, though, what would you say are the 3 CRM features that are non-negotiable, must-have from day one?
Yeah, great question. And I think I'm glad you mentioned the patient experience piece, because I think a lot of times when we start down these conversations around CRM, it is typically very business focused, revenue focused, kind of what are the outcomes for the business. But I think when done really well, I think it should be this balance of, yes, how do we make sure the operations is running smoother? We can track data throughout the entire life cycle, but also how are we making that patient's experience at every touch point a better one. And so I think analyzing a lot of these features through both of these lenses, what is it doing for the business? What is it doing for the individuals who work here? And then what is it doing for the patient? Often helps you prioritize the right functionality in the right order, because there might be certain features that are amazing internally, but they don't impact the customer at all. They don't make a difference for the people who are walking through the door on a day-to-day basis. And you want to make sure that if you can, you're prioritizing your investment in areas that touch all 3 of those components. So to your earlier question, what are the 3 kind of must-have CRM functionalities. And I think this is going to be basic, right? Because it's not the bells and whistles. And I think this is part of the challenge when people are evaluating CRM systems kind of in general, is there's a lot of demos about these really exciting things and lots of automations and things that you can apply. But I think to get CRM right, there's some fundamentals that you have to put in place. So one is thinking about data capture. So how are you going to capture data, whether that is somebody at reception, picking up the phone, booking an appointment, if that is a self-serve form, making sure that every element of capturing data is consistent. Because what you don't want to do is create a CRM system that's intaking data automatically, which has a slightly different process than people who are manually enter data, by seeing somebody or picking up the phone. And then all of a sudden, we're kind of creating a mess. And now trying to figure out who Bob is, because Bob's maybe filled out a form on the website, or he's requested some information and then he picked up the phone and spoke to a receptionist. And now all of a sudden, we've got a lot of versions of Bob, and Bob is very confusing to us. And now we've just made our lives a lot harder. So I think that's the first fundamental piece, is when you're designing CRM, think about not only the data elements that you want to report on, but how you're going to capture that data consistently to create as little kind of data issues and duplication as possible. So what are the fundamentals to data, and how do we design systems to make sure that we are adhering to those principles? I think the other piece is looking at how we automate and improve the core business process itself. So again, rather than kind of taking and trying to look at what we do today, maybe thinking about where technology can improve and automate. So simple things like workflows and task reminders, where I take a paper process that clinicians do every day. I don't necessarily just start capturing that in a system, right? I might as well capture that in Excel if that were the case. But I take that and I reimagine that process in a way that we can maybe reduce clicks, maybe reduce touch points by automating some of that, and just trying to, again, ease the tension on the people who are managing the data. So basic workflow management in whatever CRM you're looking at, there's typically some functionality that will let you automate as much as possible. So I think data capture, structuring your data, automating the process as much as possible. And then the third piece is reporting. So every CRM system will have the benefit of giving you this data back in some way that is actionable. So the hope is that the data gives you insights to either make better decisions, to make different decisions, to act quicker. But I think if you start your CRM journey thinking about how that data can impact how you run the business, it tends to mean that you design in a slightly different way. So rather than, again, just kind of thinking about that as is process and then building fields and data capture forms and things to complete that process in a technical way, starting with the end game of thinking about, okay, what reporting and what insights do we really need to run this business? How do I make sure that we're capturing those? And then you almost design backwards to ensure that the output of all of that is something that is going to be useful to different functions and roles across the business.
So again, so critical, as I was saying before, for the marketing function to be able to, take that data, as you say, track it all the way through, and then, feed it back so that you really understand where's your money going and where you're spending that marketing money, and is it turning into the desired end results. It's interesting. So I work with several clinics who, some have kind of practice management softwares that have kind of light CRM capabilities. A lot of practices have a separate CRM to their project management or practice management software, and don't necessarily want the two to talk to each other for privacy and GDPR. When does a clinic need to move a lead from CRM to practice management approach, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of that is slightly dependent on the platform that you use. So, and this takes people some time to get their head around, but the benefits of something like Salesforce is it can do both, right? It can operate at that lead generation side of the funnel, but then you can transition into program management and patient care. And so it's got a whole set of modules that think about, how we deliver care to patients, which is completely different than, how we capture leads and therefore convert to revenue. And it's got some sophistication in it that allows you to put the right kind of permission levels and security in place so that, you don't necessarily have people seeing both sides of that coin. So some of that decision is down to the tools that you use. In a perfect world, you would have a platform like Salesforce that allows you to make that seamless transition. And part of that is back to my earlier principle around data and not wanting to necessarily duplicate data and have issues where it's hard to kind of marry up this single view of the customer in a single platform where you can kind of seamlessly transition that. You can trace that life cycle back, which is much easier than lots of integrations where I'm looking at IDs to kind of marry up these individual patient records. I think the one thing that sometimes makes people nervous, we had a customer of ours who was a cancer-focused kind of clinic, and they didn't want to capture a lot of data. They had anonymized everything, right? And so the idea of CRM scared them because they felt like they were almost doing a disservice to patients. They wanted to capture the trends and the analytics around who was coming to the clinic and what was working and what wasn't, but they didn't want to necessarily capture individual names. But then when you looked at that, and then you looked at this kind of full end-to-end process of being able to take that person from somebody who maybe comes into the clinic for additional information to somebody who actually starts coming under their care, and for months, years after that, being able to see that trail of how we've interacted with somebody in the very beginning of their journey. And then, all of because it wasn't just clinicians, it was benefits advisors and psychologists, how all of these people have created this entire kind of hub of care around this patient is really critical. But in order to create that traceability, you do have to start asking for that name right up front. And it took them a long time to kind of get their head around the fact that the data wasn't just for them and it wasn't just for us. It was actually to serve the patient in a much better way. And I think when they bought into that, then their data strategy changed entirely. This big push for anonymized data kind of went away because they realized that actually the power in connecting this data meant that throughout the entire life cycle of caring for this individual, we know them. And so making that transition into, what does the case management and what are the care notes and all of that look like downstream means that really we need to just think about that data capture process holistically. And I do think that's sometimes difficult in healthcare for people to get their heads around, like, data, GDPR regulations, all of that feels overwhelming. And I think the reaction to that sometimes is to capture less data. I think what we need to lean into is understanding the benefit this data can have, but also the guardrails that we put around it. So things that I mentioned before around sharing and permission, and maybe not necessarily opening all of that data up to the entire organization, being really diligent and careful about who sees what, at what point in time, how long I keep this data. All of those things are things that can be written into policy and then systemized in a way that ensure that the data is secure and is being used for the purposes it was intended, but we don't have to limit ourselves in that data capture area just because we're scared of where that data might go.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to think about and talk about. Obviously, marketing, sales, that side of the coin has a bad rap a lot of the time, but at the end of the day, this really can contribute to better patient experience and better patient outcomes if, as you say, you're capturing the right data. And that kind of leads into this next section that I want to talk to you about, which, for, again, going back to marketing, capturing the leads and calls and attribution, all these things are so important. Sometimes with certain systems, we've had trouble making sure that phone calls get, recorded properly. And, so how do you make sure that phone calls, web forms, walk-ins all become records in the CRM reliably?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. I think one is, as I mentioned before, it's down to the platform that you use. So some platforms will be easier to integrate and automate some of those functions than others. So if I just take Salesforce as the example, Salesforce allows you to connect seamlessly into Outlook or Google Mail, whatever you use as your email server, and it captures those activities automatically. So if somebody sends me an email or somebody sends me a calendar invite, that automatically flows through to my CRM, and I'm no longer relying on people remembering to swivel chair and put those activities in, but I'm getting the data that I want and reducing the effort that I'm asking people to make in a manual sense. So I think some of that is down to how do you leverage the tools kind of in your toolkit to create some of that automation and integration. And then some of that is down to the process itself, right? So there will always be things that, require a human to either augment, meaning maybe it told me there was an activity, but there's no notes. I don't know what you discussed necessarily. So somebody will always have to kind of come in and put some notes behind that to make it meaningful. But I think, again, back to that concept of having people really understand how this data is going to be used to make the patient experience better tends to then color how people capture data and why people capture data. I think that's a little bit where CRM systems go wrong, is the impulse is to capture as much data as possible. And so people will build, lots of objects and lots of fields, and they'll say to people, okay, great, start putting all of this data in. But the reality as an individual is if I don't find value in that activity, I'm probably just going to bypass it because I've got a lot of stuff that I need to do today. And, I have patients I need to look after, and this isn't in the critical path of me being able to do that. So I think it's an element of how you best use the systems you've got, how you design the process appropriately, and then how you manage that change. So how do you make sure you're communicating the purpose behind capturing these specific elements and how it's going to be used? And I think when people really see how it's used to better serve the patient, I think they're more inclined to then fill in those forms, fill in those fields.
Yeah. It's such it's a multifaceted part, and I think it's interesting. Like, there's so much data, it can get really noisy. So I think being choosy about what you're putting in there is really important. So I mentioned calls before. We saw one clinic with phone inquiries not being logged, which kind of broke the attribution. We were able to kind of install a webhook and a third-party tool that would record and put it in the CRM, but then they still had to kind of adjust it and put that information in there, which eventually over time kind of got used to that process and that system. What common mistakes would you say kind of can make those marketing numbers lie, and how do you fix them?
Yeah, great question. So I think both lie in a positive sense and in a negative sense. And you see this in different examples. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we think about that attribution model, a lot of times if we don't have that traceability that you mentioned in terms of the call comes in, I'm attributing it to the right campaign, to the right code, and then it kind of flows seamlessly through. In the absence of that, what often happens is people either don't attribute it to anything, and then everything kind of falls into this big marketing bucket, or they falsely attribute it to things. And now all of a sudden it looks like this particular campaign massively overperformed, but actually when you look at the root cause of that, it's because it's the first value in the pick list. And so somebody has to say, what campaign did this come through? And all they're doing is selecting that drop down and picking the first thing. And so I think some of that is looking at, is the data telling the right story? And if it's not, being inquisitive in terms of what's the root cause? Because it sometimes isn't super systematic. It will be a breakdown in data entry and a breakdown in the process itself. You also have other elements that skew the numbers when it comes to conversion. So if I look at a lead coming in, and let's just say that gets passed to an internal sales team, you'll have a lot of sales behaviors that tend to skew that. So one that we see frequently in CRM is a lead will come in, somebody will have a conversation. Rather than converting that lead and putting it in their pipeline, they don't really want to do that because now everybody can see it in their pipeline and the pressure's there. So what they'll do is they'll close that lead, they'll keep it in their little kind of notepad, they'll continue to follow up, they'll create that as a contact separately. And then when they do feel confident, then they'll put it in the pipeline. And all of a sudden it looks like this is a brand new person and a brand new deal that we had no visibility of, but it's because we've broken that link. And a lot of times that's not it's not a malicious sales activity. It's because, again, no one explained the purpose of conversion and how that data is leveraged for attribution. So I didn't know I was breaking it. I just knew I didn't want to put it in the pipeline at that point in time. And this was my way of doing that. So again, I think some of the change management around people really understanding how the process impacts reporting, attribution, what that means in terms of where we spend our money, where we invest. I think having that holistic conversation with everybody who's going to be interacting with the CRM is really important. And then to your point around some of the automations, I do think that making sure that you are diligent in how you design those, because again, a lot of times you can be really sophisticated with certain kind of social channels or web forms coming in, and they can do a lot of attribution behind the scenes, just tagging campaign codes and things like that. But what we sometimes see as well in that space is it's set up really well. When it launches, it's great. And then people don't really understand how that's been built. And so as new campaigns evolve over time, that back end process doesn't necessarily change. And so people are confused when the data comes in because they're like, oh, well, God, we've done a lot of marketing in this space. But it's because the granular code stopped getting created because no one understood that that's how that piece of the puzzle was working. And, someone who built that ages ago has left the business and never handed it over. So I think there's both the people aspect and then the technical aspect. So whatever's doing that attribution, really understanding how that process works and making sure that it is designed properly, but then scales over time and doesn't necessarily, die because it is not being looked after.
So would you say, attribution is so critical. How do you pragmatically attribute that patient to a marketing channel when sometimes that conversion happens, so many weeks later? We've seen, patients go through, email sequence and take a whole year to actually convert. How do you make sure that you're attributing things correctly?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. And I think part of the trick is understanding that attribution is typically not a one-time activity, right? I think this is where systems at least sometimes break down is you want to look at a patient, you want to know where did that patient come from? It wasn't a single campaign. It wasn't a single email. It wasn't a single phone call. It typically is a series of activities, like you said, over the course of months, a year, that then led that person to enlist you to be their primary care agent, right? And so I think having an attribution model that assumes kind of a multi-channel approach and a multi-campaign approach and looking at campaign influence as opposed to hard attribution is a much better way to go, because I think you get a much more realistic view of all of the touch points and all of the activity that then led to this conversion at a certain point in time, and how granular you get with that in terms of kind of percentages. If you want to allocate, we think it was primarily this campaign, but then maybe these activities as a secondary action. You can get quite sophisticated with some of these algorithms, but I think at the heart, you just want to make sure that your attribution model isn't too one-sided in terms of really forcing people to look at a list of things that may or may not have contributed and having somebody select one semi-arbitrarily. You want to make sure you've got a holistic picture of all of the things that might be working to get to that point of conversion.
And I suppose that is just a matter of how you designed the system and putting in those traceable touch points, as you say, okay, yes, they came in through a PPC campaign, but then they were in this email sequence for a very long time. So then you can kind of measure how they're interacting with the emails, and then eventually, and then that's really interesting, and actually kind of weighting what actually. So yeah, I think that's really fascinating. So talking about the capturing this lead, filling in those fields that make up a lead. What would you say, what fields should every new lead capture so we can, route it, score it, and report on it later?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's difficult because it's different for every organization, right? It depends, so your assignment rules, that all, and your kind of scoring criteria and grading criteria, all of that will lead you to what are the right set of fields. Traditionally, it's everything that you can at first stop, think about capturing on a form, right? So somebody's name, somebody's email address, somebody's phone number, all the things that you need to get in touch with them. That's kind of the first port of call. And then typically what we tell people from a design perspective, because again, in an effort to not overload the users and the system, people want to score on 100 things and they start creating 100 fields. And typically what we say is if you start with how you're going to prioritize these leads, so whether that's a grading model or a scoring model, some sense of what a good lead looks like to you and why you would pick lead A over lead B, then that starts to give you some of the details around the elements that you need to capture to be able to automate some of that prioritization. So I'll give you a really good example. We were working on a project this week, not clinician, but it was somebody who sells cars. So a dealer that deals in the automotive industry. And when somebody hits their form, they work across a load of different dealers. Some dealers have 50 cars and 50 shops around the country. Some is a one-man band trying to sell a single car, right? And so when we looked at their lead capture form, originally it was just name, email address. What do you want to sell? A car or a motorcycle or a bus? And then when we looked at, okay, well, why would you call lead A versus B? They said, well, we don't know. We have to just call everybody. And then when we dug into what does a good lead look like, it's typically somebody who has more than one distribution center. So not a man with one car, but somebody who's going to be able to sell cars in multiple locations, and somebody whose lot has multiple cars, so ideally over 10. And so then you start to think about, okay, how do we create this prioritization model? And really that prioritization model came down to 2 fields: number of locations, average car per location. And from that, we could kind of then think about coupling that with where they are in the country, how much coverage our particular kind of sales team had over there, and create a much more sophisticated prioritization model. But I think it typically comes down to less than a handful of fields, but getting at what those really critical elements are, kind of, you have to take a bit of a step back and look at what does a good lead look like, and then work backwards from there.
That makes a lot of sense. And so now they're a lead, we're putting them into our sales funnel, as we like to call them in marketing, or sometimes I've heard them called pipelines in CRM. But essentially, it's the stages, I guess, of that, in our case, the sales process that we're talking about. So if you had to prescribe, one simple pipeline for the average clinic, what would those kind of critical stages be, do you think?
Yes, and it's a great question, because this is often, again, another place where people sometimes add complexity where they don't need it. And so a lot of times when we look at people who've had CRM systems for a long time, especially in that lead funnel, they've got 8-10 stages, and you think, no, actually the whole purpose behind a lead is really qualification. So if you take that at its base, you're not trying to necessarily close a deal in that lead stage, right? You're not even trying to necessarily get to an understanding of timeline and budget. You're just trying to get an understanding of, is there a timeline and is there a budget? And so being really conscious that you don't want to put too much process onus on that lead. So you want to convert it as quickly as possible to get it into pipeline, to then put it through a separate sales process, sales stages. So being really diligent with keeping those lead stages pretty crisp, pretty clean, and things that people understand. I think the other kind of issue that people sometimes have is they create really creative language around the process. And it means that when you hire somebody, that process isn't necessarily intuitive. So being really clear that, these don't have to be words that you've invented, right? They can be open, contacted, qualified, converted. It can be as simple as that. But I think making sure that when you think about moving from one stage to another, it's intuitive for a user, but there's also purpose in driving that movement in the process. So there's a fundamental difference between somebody who has just come in and somebody who's been contacted. Because now I know that everybody who's in this open stage, as an example, needs to be followed up. And I can start to create metrics around how long it takes us to pick up the phone when one of those open leads comes in. contact, it tells me that somebody's in an active conversation with them. They just haven't qualified them yet. So again, the definitions around these stages are really critical, and less about kind of what you call them, but more people really understanding why one lead moves through these stages and how we're going to report on that and how it impacts how we think about the process. And then critically, what is that definition around conversion? So to your point, when we think about pipeline, this lead funnel then converts into a sales pipeline, which is typically when people start to look at forecasting revenue, forecasting timelines against that revenue. We always say to people, everything in that lead cycle is a bucket of stuff that may or may not come in. If you think about it as kind of business cards that are in one big bucket, you might get nothing out of them, you might get something amazing out of them, but we don't really know them yet. When I get into pipeline, we know them and we know that there's a deal there. And so making sure that we're all making that conversion at the same point. You see a lot of sales organizations where people have kind of interpreted their own definition of what is a lead versus, what should really constitute sales pipeline. And some people will hold a lead much longer than others, and then therefore that kind of sandbags the pipeline. Others will convert straight away because they don't want to have to fill in all the lead fields and they want to just get it into pipeline. But I think having consistency across your organization in terms of those definitions, and critically when it converts, just means that your reporting will just hold more water. I think that's where it gets dangerous, is we create a lot of process and a lot of sales stages across the life cycle, and people don't understand what they're used for, and then it makes the reporting completely skewed.
You touched on something in that answer about response times. This is such a critical thing. Have you seen any data, or what would you say about critical response times? What should the ideal response time be? How do you kind of make operational changes to enforce that in clinics? And CRM is very connected with all of that. So can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at kind of coming in and auditing existing lead processes, this is the number one area where we typically put SLAs and things in place, because when you look at a lot of the data, and this is different industry to industry, but consistent across the board for everyone, the faster that you can get to that lead, the more chance that you have of converting it. And so a lot of times it's a very easy problem to solve, right? Make sure that that lead is getting in the hands of somebody who's going to be able to follow up as quickly as possible. And so the mistake that a lot of organizations make is a lead will come in through an automated function. Somebody fills out a form on the website, and then it gets put into a bucket. And then this bucket sits there because it's not sitting with an individual. No one's told people to go get things from the bucket. And it spends a long time kind of floating around before it ultimately ends up in someone's queue, or it ends up in someone's name. And then, yes, then they're on the hook for the SLAs. But people sometimes forget about that upfront process. So thinking about how quickly we can get this in the hands of somebody who's going to follow up, and then what's the expectation around, as an individual, how quickly we assume you're going to do that. Like one of the organizations we work with had a high volume of leads coming in, loads sitting in that bucket for weeks. I mean, if a lead is sitting there for weeks, the chance of you converting it after all of that time is pretty slim, right? And when you talk to the sales team, they said, well, I've just got too much on. I'm managing all of these accounts. I'm responding to all these RFPs. Like, the lead list is the last thing, on my kind of to-do list. And I don't get around to it as frequently as I would like to. And one of the major changes that this organization made was realizing that actually the value of these leads meant that if they hired a small inside sales team to just contact those leads ASAP, as soon as they hit the system, they could increase conversion and then pay for that team fivefold. Because there was some anecdotal evidence in that where they had big leads coming through. So somebody saying, I want to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds. And you think, oh my God, and no one responded to that. But because, it's not necessarily anybody's job description to do that. You're kind of asking somebody to do that on a long list of activities that they do on a daily basis. And so I think sometimes it is thinking about the process, thinking about implementing some of these SLAs, but also taking a pragmatic approach to say, are these SLAs possible? Because it's easy to say, okay, well, every lead should be followed up in 24 hours. But if people don't have the capacity internally to do that, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to hire people to do that because this is a high enough priority where the investment warrants it? Are you going to automate it, which is always another path to go down? Do you kind of create, through a marketing automation tool, a nurture journey where it feels to the customer like you've responded immediately, but maybe it's not necessarily a human doing that? And we're seeing more and more this kind of agentic approach where you've got agents as your kind of BDR inside sales team that are doing that outreach. So again, it is a one-to-one, but it's not a human on the other end. So I think there's a lot of different approaches, but the number one objective should be to get to that lead as quickly as you can. Because you think about how much, back to the marketing attribution point, think about how much you spend on marketing to get these leads in. Like every hour it sits there, you're losing money. And so being able to capitalize more on that conversion is really critical.
Do you have any tips on how you would, I guess, design a basic triage system so enquiries are, responded to quickly, matched to the right clinician or maybe package of services? Like, what's that kind of first step?
Definitely. And you see this a lot because everybody's trying to automate, right? Everybody gets to the point where they've designed a lead process. Potentially, they don't see the conversion that they were hoping for. They know they've got a high volume of leads and they kind of don't know what to do with it. So I think most of the time when you look at it, the first instinct is, okay, well, we need better prioritization, we need better routing. But actually, when you peel it back, in order to do that, most of the time, you need a different lead capture process, because most of the issue is when you look at somebody's kind of contact us form, it's name, email, and then a big box where you ask people, what's your message? What do you want from us? And it's all just unstructured text. And so as much as a salesperson can look at that and understand maybe, some of the background, they have to read all of that. So unless you've got an agent who's doing that for you, you can, as a first step, restructure those forms in a different way to capture that data in a more structured format. So simple things like, what service are you interested in? And then being able to select from a list or, tick multiple boxes. What's your timeline? How quickly do you need to see someone? And, somebody might say, this is an emergency. I need to see somebody this week. So all of those elements are probably what people are putting in the box itself, but they're just writing it in an anecdotal fashion. That means when it comes into the CRM, it's hard for us to do anything with. If we kind of pull that apart, take away the big text box and give them some structured fields to tell us what they need, then instantly we can help prioritize that lead and get it to the right person so that they can respond quickly. And they've got, a much easier view of what this person is asking for than having to read through lots of text.
Yeah, and that's something that we would certainly want to work closely with a CRM team like yourself. I mean, there's so many ways you can design forms, in a staged way that capture information in a very simple, kind of reasonable way that actually guides the patient. And yeah, I mean, there's so much that could be done with that. So, what small kind of automations or templates would you say kind of move the needle for conversion without annoying patients, if we're talking about, these maybe automated emails coming back and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think the first one is that data capture piece. So automating data capture, because a lot of times what you'll see is people will have a form on the website, but that form then sends an email to somebody, or it goes into an Outlook inbox, or it goes into a giant spreadsheet. It's not necessarily connected to their CRM. So when I think about automation, that would be the first place I invest, is whatever somebody fills out on my website, having that automatically come through as a lead, just because it means that you're capturing all of your data consistently in one place. And that reporting in terms of when did the lead come in, how quickly did we respond, all of that becomes possible when I am ingesting in a consistent way. So that would be the first piece, is how do I get all of my data that's captured electronically into a CRM system kind of seamlessly through an integration. And then the next piece around automation, I would say, rather than necessarily a lot of back and forth from a nurture journey perspective, I think it's all around what we were talking about. So routing it to the right person, making sure I do have SLAs in place, and there are things that the system can do. So we designed one for a customer where they had a group of inside salespeople based on the lead that came in and the location that lead was in. It went to a particular individual. But let's just say that individual was out to lunch or they were just overwhelmed for the day. It gave them a 6-hour time frame. If they hadn't picked up that lead and moved it to working, which meant they made a call, then it would route to someone else and it went into someone else's queue. And so there's some process in place that you can make sure that you just don't have leads stagnating. I think that's the most important kind of first piece of the puzzle, is how quickly can we get back in touch with them? And like I said, you can automate some of the emails and things, if that is almost a fallback. I think if you can get a person in front of them, absolutely do it. But then yes, as a fallback, you could look at, what more could an email or an agent do to push the process along.
That's great advice. You can't ever beat the human touch, but sometimes it does help if you have an admin team that's overloaded. So use with caution, perhaps, these automations. So all CRM systems are not created equally, and sometimes there needs to be integrations or kind of maybe a minimum stack of things that come with it. What integrations should clinics prioritize in their first 90 days with their CRM, kind of phones, bookings, forms, their practice management software? What are the critical things that must work together?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, and some of this is going to be, again, depending on the CRM platform that you have, because some of these platforms will let you expose more and more functionality. So you don't necessarily have to integrate. So if you just take Salesforce as the example, Salesforce has something called Service Cloud Voice, which lets you do that telephony piece without having to have another provider integrate that CTI bit in. It kind of is all seamless and it captures transcripts and recordings and all of that. So some of that's going to be down to your technical landscape and some of the architecture design in terms of how you expose some of these functionalities. But I think in terms of just assuming those things are all separate, I think the critical piece is activity capture, because that is where a lot of your trend analysis is going to be. So if you can automate that as much as possible, because it tends to be where people spend the most of their time trying to put activities in and capture, what they've done. If you can automate that, it saves them loads of time, and that data is invaluable because you just have a true sense of all of these touch points. So I would say activity tracking, meaning email, events, phone, but in terms of calls, not necessarily in terms of recordings and things. I think especially depending on what you're trying to achieve, if it's all around conversion rates and trying to make sure that front end of the funnel is working and is yielding results, then I would probably think about marketing automation integrations. If my gut is to, I want to scale and I want to make sure that we're serving the patient in a better way, then I would probably integrate transcripts so I can see the conversations that people are having and analyze kind of sentiment and things like that. So some of those initial integrations, I think, are down to what is the primary purpose in this first instance of this CRM, and what are we trying to get out of it, because that landscape will look different based on what I'm trying to get out of it. And what we typically tell people is have your roadmap be really purpose driven. So maybe in the first instance, it is understanding marketing attribution. So we can understand if we're getting the return on our investment for all of these marketing campaigns that we're running. And if that's the purpose of the MVP, great, then let's spend money on those integrations and those automations. And then maybe, the next focus is around integrating patient care. And so then maybe my patient care management system becomes the next piece of the puzzle. So I think rather than looking at it from a pure technical point of view, or even from a data point of view, thinking about what we want to achieve and then mapping that roadmap to the infrastructure that allows us to do that.
Yeah. And kind of connecting all these things together. One of the integrations that we've employed with one of the CRM systems that we worked with, just because it can't do it by itself, is kind of the value attribution. So when somebody turns into a patient, how much do they end up spending, and kind of putting that information from the CRM back into basically the algorithm, the PPC ads and so on and so forth. And we use some middleware software or a webhook like Zapier. So when do you think middleware like Zapier is sensible, and when should we push for a native integration instead?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you've got really, when it comes to integration at a high level, you've got three options. You've either got point to point, meaning you are coding from one system to another. You've got what I call connectors. So Zapier falls into that bucket where you're accelerating that connection, but it's more kind of by dragging fields and mappings around rather than kind of code. And then you've got your more kind of enterprise service bus type approach. So those are, your MuleSofts, your Informatica back in the day, but kind of your more robust kind of integration layers. And so where you fall on that middleware spectrum tends to be based on a couple of factors. So one is, what's the long-term integration strategy? And this is where people sometimes go wrong, is they'll connect one system up and they'll use Zapier, and then they'll connect another one up, and then they'll maybe use a different connector. And then before you know it, you're managing lots of connectors. And because all of those connectors tend to be transaction based, all of a sudden that becomes really expensive. Whereas if you knew, yes, it was going to be this integration day one, but the roadmap said we're going to have these 10 integrations by the end of our second year, you might put a different integration strategy in place and get something like a MuleSoft that allowed some more scale and just more growth over time. And then on the point-to-point side, again, this is an area where people tend to, if it's going to be a single integration and Zapier is not an option, they might just code single integration. What happens a lot in those situations is the use case tends to start really simply. It's like, I just need to send this field. And so it's like, okay, we'll write this integration, we'll send this field to this system. And then over time it's like, oh, well, but it would be great to get this field back. And, by the time this thing is built, you've designed an enterprise service bus because you've got so much going back and forth, and then you have to think about error handling and all of this stuff that these tools tend to give you out of the box, that just create ease of maintenance and create less risk in some of these integrations going down. So that's the only thing I will say, is when people think about point to point, it sounds easier and it sounds cheaper, but it can spaghetti quite quickly.
So being selfish as my marketing hat here, what I really need this to do is make sure that the booking outcomes, the booked surgeries and the revenue sync back to the marketing so we can really measure ROI. What's your recommendation on making sure that happens through your CRM system?
Yeah, it'll depend entirely on where that data is captured. So sometimes that'll be captured in a patient management system. Sometimes it'll be captured directly in the ERP if we're looking at the financial side of things. So in any case, it will be an integration, because typically Salesforce isn't going to do that, or the CRM system isn't going to do that back end finance processing. So it will be an integration, and it will be a fairly robust integration. So I would say probably point to point is not the desired approach, but whether or not you use a connector or whether or not you use kind of an enterprise service bus, I think is entirely down to the type of backend systems that you are integrating to, and how many data points are flowing back and forth.
And I think you've already touched on some of this a little bit, but with these integrations, what are some of the typical maybe problems you've seen when connecting a practice management software or your booking billing ERP system back to a CRM, and how do you avoid those mistakes?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of considerations up front. One is, rarely do these systems speak the same language. So being conscious that mapping exercise is critical and is going to take you some time to really understand what a customer is in CRM versus ERP versus patient management. Like, they'll all have a slight different flavor of that. So being able to connect all of that data is really critical. So understanding what those different elements in each system are called, how they're governed, who creates them, like the flow of data is really critical. But in terms of the integration build itself, a lot of times where I think the biggest mistakes get made are in error logging and error handling. So from a front end user perspective, the assumption is the integration always works, right? But if I'm building an integration from scratch and it makes a call out and it doesn't get anything back, there has to be something that tells me, either as an admin or a user, that something didn't work and therefore somebody needs to do something about it. We've seen a lot of integrations where people don't necessarily pay attention enough to that process. And then all of a sudden, you know, you've got weeks worth of data that you think is going back and forth, and you're looking at a dashboard and it's like, oh, these numbers just like really aren't adding up. Like we're really, you know, suffering here in terms of attribution to revenue because, you know, the numbers have kind of fallen off the cliff. Maybe the numbers haven't fallen off the cliff. Maybe the integration just hasn't been running as you think it has, but because that error handling isn't built into the process and it's not obvious to the end user, it's kind of in a back, you know, function, then you don't see it. So I think thinking about when you're designing these integrations, not only the happy path of making sure that data flows from the system of entry to the system you want it to be in, and vice versa, but thinking about the unhappy path of what happens, what are the typical issues that we could run into when this process does break down. Are there any critical functions that are now going to be burdened, and how do we make sure that we're resolving that as quickly as possible?
So circling back to something we were talking earlier about kind of on the automation side, I think it sounds like there's such a massive menu of automations you could be choosing from here. What are your kind of recommendations on, you know, automations that every clinic maybe should have in the beginning of their CRM journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would actually, the reverse of that, which is, you know, beware of automations to a certain extent. I think especially automations and notifications. What we see a lot of times is people who are moving from a more paper-based process get really excited about all the things in the system that you can automate and notify. And what you tend to see is people wanting to make sure that the users are notified as much as possible. And then all of a sudden, as an end user who's logging into this thing, you know, I'm getting 10 emails a day. Like, don't forget to update this. Did you know that this has expired? And it becomes so overwhelming that I end up not paying attention to any of them. And so what we tell people is just be really purposeful with, especially when it's going to end users, these notifications. Like, it should be for critical functions. People should know exactly what to do when they get them. So just thinking about the element of, not inundating users when we think about all of these really helpful things that we're going to give them. And then on the automation side, I think, you know, the power of automation is amazing, and it tends to be why people buy these systems, right? It's the difference between me being able to capture this data in a really elaborate Excel framework versus a CRM system. It's because I can trigger actions and automate things on the back of that. I think just making it be really clear to users where that is happening and what's happening behind the scenes. Because I think that's the piece when we think about kind of user-centric design. I think that's sometimes the piece that gets left out of the puzzle is you draw up an amazing process map and the user inputs some data, and then all of a sudden the system goes away and it creates some automation over here and it sends it here. But the user doesn't necessarily know all of that's happening. And so sometimes what you'll see is some of those activities end up getting duplicated just because there's not an education of what's happening kind of behind the scenes. So I think making sure that when you're designing these, you're communicating what's being automated, and it's really a conversation with the user to say, what is helpful for me to automate and what actually may make your life harder if I do automate it, because it kind of goes into this black box. There's areas where we've seen people try to automate things where if you ask the users, they're like, no, that would take me 30 seconds. I would rather me just do it because then I can customize it, I can personalize it, you know, whatever the situation is. So I think just being cautious of too many automations, but where you are going to do them, being purposeful and communicating to the users what's happening.
Makes a lot of sense. Just think about it and make sure that you're doing, what would you want to get? How many emails would you want to get? I think is probably a great rule of thumb there. So like, to make sure you're not making these mistakes, what simple fallback or test should we build into perhaps our processes when we're designing these? So the wrong email doesn't go to the wrong patient or too much interaction and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. I think one is, don't underestimate the power of user acceptance testing, UAT. I think sometimes people think about that as a technical exercise, and they approach it in very much a, you know, when I click this button, does it work? Is the system doing what we thought it would? And yes, it does, it does serve that function. But in addition to that, I think when facilitated correctly, UAT can be really powerful in determining if the process is correct, in determining where users are going to trip on the process, where it's non-intuitive, where potentially we need some more training. So almost using that activity as, yes, testing the functionality, but also testing the way the user engages with that functionality. Because sometimes it does mean we need to change it. Like there are too many clicks. And when somebody starts actually doing it in an operational function, they're like, oh, this is really hard. So it might mean that that piece needs to be redesigned, or it might mean, back to the kind of education piece, that we just might need to explain to people why this operates the way that it does and how that data is being used when it comes to training. So I think that can be really useful in terms of giving us a lot of insight into, does the process work? Is it intuitive? How do we support people through it? And not underestimating that piece. I also think the other piece is when you go live, because people, typically you go through this implementation, you come out of this testing phase, you go live, and everybody's like, oh, God, okay, we're done. But really understanding that the true kind of user experience starts at go live, and that's something that needs to continue to be monitored, to evolve if it's not working. And so being really conscious that the first kind of couple of weeks are going to be learning weeks, and being not only willing to change the process if you get feedback from users that it's not working or it can be improved, but being geared up to do that. So a lot of times what people will do is everybody goes live, and then you've got a partner who's doing this implementation, and they go away, and everything is expected to transition to BAU day one, giving yourself the mechanisms to know that there is going to be kind of a hypercare period where we do want to evolve things probably quicker than you would do in a normal BAU cycle, and that not being a surprise. So having the budget, having the resources available to do it, having the process to capture feedback being something that's ingrained in how you roll the system out. There's a lot that you can do in how people first interact with the system that helps you really understand how people are going to use this, and gives users confidence that you are going to listen to them, but creating all of those mechanisms and being really purposeful with how you explain that process to people. So it doesn't feel like, oh my God, I've gotten the system now, all of a sudden you're changing stuff. No. We know we're going to launch it. We know there's going to be feedback when you actually start using it on a day-to-day basis. We are happy to evolve that to better meet your needs. And this is the mechanism by which we'll capture that feedback, impact analysis, and then start to scope, these changes into the platform itself. So I think there's a lot that in that planning and readiness stage that you can do both in UAT and in that kind of go live period to really optimize that process.
And so, in your experience with clinics and healthcare organizations, are there any automation, maybe recipes or reliable things that you can put in place that will increase booking rates and just really make a commercial difference?
I think there's a couple of things. I think there is, back to, and we were talking about this with the lead capture form, back to this balance of kind of capturing as much information as we want internally to be able to route and prioritize and do all of these downstream processes, balancing that with how much I'm asking a patient to fill in. So thinking, I think you said it, Taylor, thinking about kind of dynamic fields and progressive profiling, which allows me to not have one big sheet of 500 fields that I'm asking somebody to fill in just to book a session, but being conscious with how we design that piece up front and how we maybe collect information throughout the process and not everything up front. So don't create a massive barrier to the actual booking themselves, but maybe we capture some basic information, let them book, and then send them a follow-up to capture more. And so we kind of make it a much more sequential process instead of that burden being up front. But I think there's things to think about in balancing the data capture element. There's also just things to think about in that scheduling piece, right? How much do you want that to be self-serve. People love to be able to go in and book their own appointments, book their own sessions, but only if that process is intuitive, and only if that process is something that doesn't require me to fill in loads of things. So I think all of that design and vendor analysis in the systems that you choose are really important, because that's your first chance to lose a customer, right? If I go in and we've all had it, right? I go in and I really want to book the session and it feels really hard. I'm only going to let it take me so far. And then I'm either going to phone up or I'm going to abandon the entire process. So I think being conscious that you're making that user experience as frictionless as possible, and also where you're monitoring those abandon rates, right? Because that's the other piece of the puzzle that people forget when they put in some of these kind of self-serve functions, that you do want to make sure that if people are struggling with that functionality, that you've got a way to kind of capture them, and you can follow up with a phone call. You can still try to convert that person, even if it might not be through this kind of self-serve element.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I love a staged form. Get that basic information up front, and then if it does get more complicated, that can go later on down the line, and they can abandon it. But you've already captured that information, so that you can still call. It's all about design, isn't it? Okay, so talking about measurement and all of these things, and patient lifetime value, proving that value so that you can say, yes, my marketing pounds are going to the right place. So what 3 dashboards or reports, or how do you package this data so like the chief marketing officer of a clinic actually look at it each week and know if the CRM is working?
Yeah, great question. A lot of this, again, is going to be down to your platform. But what I would say to people is evaluate what comes out of the box first. A lot of times what we see is people think about their reporting requirements as almost completely bespoke, and then they go away and they design these reports and they design these dashboards. And then 6 months later down the line, they figured out, actually, we could have just tweaked this standard report slightly and we could have gotten this out a lot faster. So that's what I would say, is definitely make sure that you're capturing your individual requirements, but then assess those against anything out of the box, because it might be faster to just leverage those or customize those. They tend to give you, most CRMs at least, will tend to give you some pretty robust metrics and dashboards to work from. So, don't discredit those. The other thing that I would say is design those reports and dashboards in a collaborative way. And this is a piece that I think sometimes people miss. Sometimes that reporting function sits in operations, and operations then almost kind of schedules or publishes these reports, but it's not necessarily what the executives want to see, or people don't necessarily understand how to read that data. And there's this kind of overarching assumption that if I'm looking at it, that everybody speaks the same language as a marketeer. And so like, if I'm looking at it as a marketeer and I know these campaigns intimately, I know how to read this data. Like, this all makes a lot of sense to me. But if I don't sit in a marketing function, can I still pick that same report up and get those same insights? And so I think making sure that everybody kind of speaks the same language when we're looking at, what is this dashboard saying to us? And in new tools, so like Salesforce gives you the ability to narrate some of the dashboard. So rather than leaving it up for interpretation, you can say, look, this is what good looks like. What we want to achieve is here. Last year we did this. So just so that when I'm looking at it, I'm not just looking at numbers and colors. I've got some guidelines around, what this data should mean to me and what to look for. Because I think that's the other piece is, when I'm looking at the data, you want it to be actionable. You want somebody to look at it and go, okay, great, we're all on track. Let's invest more. Or, ooh, we need to dig into this area. But you almost want, in a perfect world, the dashboard to guide people to that realization. So almost say to people, this is what you're looking for. If it's less than this, then these are the potential factors, but we need to have a conversation about it. So otherwise, I think sometimes people look at these reports, they read them, but they don't really know what they're supposed to take away from them. What does good look like? Like, 70% sounds great to me. That's amazing, but we might be trying to achieve 90. So I think just, again, having that collaborative conversation around what are the right metrics, what are the right benchmarks, but then having hopefully the reporting tool do some of that narration so that people aren't relying on individuals to remember those forever and ever. It's kind of guiding them in their analysis.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for us, it's designing that and just trying to make it as clear and simple as possible. This is, the amount, essentially, we say this is the amount you're spending on search engine optimization. And then we can trace all the way to, we know that your organic leads are turning into this much revenue. So kind of keeping it as simple as that, like your, ROI on organic is X.
Yeah.
Your ROI on PPC through Google is Y, and Meta is Z, and just kind of keeping it as simple as possible is always a great rule of thumb.
Well, and there's design principles too that I think can easily be applied. Do you know what I mean? Like green and red. Like when I look at something, do I know that it's good or bad? And so thinking about not only the reports, but also like, are there design elements and visual components that make that job really easy for me if I'm an outside interpreter? So what are all the things that visually it just makes things super obvious?
Fantastic. Yeah, 100%. Make it simple, make it clear.
Yeah.
So talk about patient lifetime value. And what data do we need essentially to calculate it sensibly, and how can the CRM help with that?
Yeah, I think that the toughest combination of data is activity data and financial data, right? And so I think setting up data structures that help those two things connect are critical for looking at any value of a patient, but particularly lifetime value. Because I think oftentimes what you see is you'll capture a lot of activity in the CRM. So it'll be a series of appointments, sessions, phone calls, all of these things. But then when I move to the finance system, how the cost and the revenue is coded against those things aren't necessarily the same. And so trying to marry the money up to the activity isn't a straightforward exercise. And so what you want to make sure is to be able to understand what is cost of sale versus the revenue that we see kind of coming in on the back of this. All of that stuff needs to marry up. And you can quite easily do it if you're conscious about both how you're designing these data models and then that integration layer to bring both of them together. But I think that's the critical piece is, how do we make sure that we all understand what value is and where that lives and how granular we want to get, right? Because there are some people who, from an ERP system, just do not capture money at the same granular activity level that a CRM system would naturally do it. It rolls it up. And so then we need to think about on the CRM side, well, I can't put this money here, right? Because I don't have the algorithm to tell me how to disseminate those funds across these activities. I have to roll it up. And so where do I then put that when it comes to the CRM side of things? So just making sure that we are not trying to fudge, a square peg into a round hole, that we've got a similar understanding of what that financial piece looks like.
And so what early indicators tell you if the CRM is working, if it's improving bookings, maybe even before revenue shows up? How do you know?
I think a lot of that fundamental design that you do around that piece in the beginning, so the data capture element and then the reporting, should mean that instantly you can start to see that return on investment in terms of these benchmarks going up, right? So we might not necessarily know all of the calls and the emails and the activities that it takes to get a lead in, but very quickly we will start to understand that when we start to automate those in a systematic way. And so week 2, week 3, week 4, we can already start to look at, are these numbers going up, and are they going up in the way that we expected? So I think making sure, back to that beginning piece of having a very clear vision around reporting, what the metrics are, what the benchmarks are, and how we know what success looks like is critical to not just be staring at a lot of data. And I think you can, typically what we tell people is there's different kind of levels of reporting, meaning you'll see some short-term gains, you'll see long-term, you'll see strategic. And so thinking about how we look at data in a slightly different way, if it's operational kind of day-to-day data versus strategic initiatives that maybe we're investing money in, like all of the frequency and cadence and parameters around all of those things should be different. But we'll design all of that up front. So just have a very clear view of what you want to measure and why. And then systematically, you should be able to see some of that data flowing through and either proving or disproving your hypothesis kind of within the first few weeks.
And so how do you like make it as clear as possible? I guess like maybe what's the simplest before and after test to show a CRM has affected a change and actually moved the needle?
Yeah, I think the critical piece is setting those goals and those benchmarks, hard numbers, right? And a lot of times what people will do is, so you take lead conversion, right? People will say, I want lead conversion to go up. Okay, but when somebody's looking at a report, they don't know if it has gone up or not because we didn't set that benchmark. So doing some data analysis on your current situation, your current process, to put a line in the sand that says, look, we might not know it perfectly because it's not tracked in a system, but we think anecdotally 10% of the leads that come through our door actually convert. Then that gives us a benchmark to work from. It might be slightly flawed, but we'll start to measure that against the data that does come in. And then as we collect that data, that benchmark might change. So, and it should change, right? Next year, it should be different to this year, but we should always be striving in each of these metrics for a very specific number. So we want more than 10%, or we want, more than 10 a week. Like there has to be something concrete. Otherwise it's too conceptual for people to know if it's working or not.
Mm. So speaking of making it work, adoption is really important, and the people that are actually going to be using the system. What would you say kind of is the minimum training and governance you'd impose so staff don't treat the CRM as extra work? Because at the end of the day, it is learning a new system. They're used to the way they do things, perhaps, and there can be resistance. How do you kind of make that work, do you think?
I think so. There's a critical component to any good training, which is I think you have to explain the why and not just the what. So a lot of times when you see people come in and train new systems, it's a lot about how. So what I need to click on to do this process, and very little about the why I'm doing it. So back to earlier conversation around really helping people understand what the data is going to be used for, how it impacts the customer, how it impacts reporting, like everything that you're asking somebody to fill in, everything that you're asking somebody to process should have a purpose behind it. And I think when you're really clear about what that purpose is, people are more inclined to adopt, to follow the process. But I think that's typically the missing component of any training is it should be 80% why and 20% how. And it tends to be the reverse, if at all, why. And so really, really making sure that people understand the importance of this, because it's their job as an individual to, monitor the data quality, monitor the efficiency of the process. And so if they understand why they're doing it, they tend to be all in, or they tend to tell you where it's broken, right? Where if I don't understand why I'm doing it, I can't necessarily feedback if it is broken or not. I can just tell you if I like it or if I don't like it, because I don't know what the goal was to start. So I think that's the most critical element of adoption is focus on the why.
That's fantastic advice, and obviously very often ignored, unfortunately. So great advice. So who should actually own this, do you think, inside of a clinic? Is it the marketing team? Is it the admin team, ops, clinic leadership? Who's the owner of CRM?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of that is dependent on what the purpose of CRM is. And that, what do we want out of CRM, is going to drive a lot of things. It's going to drive how much functionality you integrate into. It's going to drive what does that roadmap look like over time. It's going to drive the data structures, but it should also drive who owns it, right? If the whole purpose of this CRM is to make sure that we are converting leads, then maybe marketing should own it. If the purpose is patient care, then maybe the head of clinician should own it. So I think that ownership question isn't a one size fits all. I think it's who is most motivated to drive its success based on the purpose behind which we purchased it. So I think that's one element. I think what I would say in a kind of more generic fashion is it has to have top-down support. I think where CRM struggle is where a single department owns it, is trying to drive a change in process, but it's not necessarily driven down at an executive level, and it's impacting people who don't sit in that department, and it kind of all starts to fall apart. So I think having very clear vision organizationally at the highest level around why this investment is so important is really critical, but then somebody to kind of manage the change and push the success of the platform through should sit with the right team who's got the right motivation to see it through.
Yeah, and it's clear, from what you just said, that a lot of people are going to potentially, touch the CRM system in different parts and in different ways of the process. So, are there kind of permission models or things that you can put in place to prevent accidental deletions, or ways to keep the data clean, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the critical pieces in that design, especially where the CRM is kind of seamlessly either integrating or transitioning into patient care. I think you want to, in those examples, be even more diligent around it. But when you're thinking about that upfront kind of security and permissions design process, typically what we say to people is, start with the lowest level of access and then kind of work yourself up. So rather than starting with the concept of sharing all data in a clinical situation, we would say, okay, who needs to see what data and for what purpose? And then you kind of open up data as those use cases arise. And most platforms these days have loads of different ways of managing permissions and security. So you can be really, purposeful in locking a lot of that down. And you can feel really, I think, especially when you compare it to something like, pieces of paper and stuff, which you've got no authority over. I think there's a lot that you can do there to make sure that it's sitting within the policies that you've already kind of created. So I think it's critical. It takes more time than you think it will. I mean, it sounds like, one of those things, it's like, well, should be really straightforward. Bob's going to see this and Anne's going to see that. And it's like, well, no, because typically you're looking at object level, field level. So, even on the patient record, maybe everybody sees the name, but then, there might be 20, 30, 50 fields. Only certain teams see certain things, only certain individuals see certain things. So I think, giving yourself enough time to think about all of the different use cases, and managing that permission at a more granular level.
That makes a lot of sense. And so I guess to put it in a nutshell, what's the fastest way to kind of win everybody over, all these people, the clinicians, the secretaries, and say, I don't have time for this, and just get them to do it?
Yeah. I think the most critical element to success in any of these things is that purpose driven behind any kind of functionality or platform that you release. It's really helping people understand what is the purpose of capturing this data and what are we going to do with it. And as long as there's good rationale behind capturing this data is going to improve my life, it's going to improve the patient's life, something is going to get easier or better as a byproduct of doing this, most people will fall in line and absolutely execute to that vision. I think it is where that's just not clear, where it feels like people are capturing data for the sake of it, right? And if you think about that clinical process, there's a lot of data capture, and there's a lot of onus on individuals to be writing down notes, and the data that moves through that patient's journey can be quite cumbersome. And so I think just not ignoring that fact, knowing that people live in a world where they're being asked to do a lot of administrative functions. Let's be purposeful with what we're asking them to do here and try to articulate where hopefully that's replacing something somewhere else, or the efficiency that they're gaining. So the what's in it for me at every level, in every role. Every person that is logging into the system should very clearly, day one, have a clear articulation of what's in it for them.
That makes a lot of sense. And so we talked a lot about the different types of data that we're collecting and the different people that are working on this. So thinking about compliance and kind of like clinical safety, where should maybe marketing consents live versus clinical consents, and how should they be modeled? How do you take care of this?
Yes. So again, this is going to be slightly dependent on the platform that you're in, because different, so Salesforce, as an example, has a really robust consent model. I think it's on its most granular, it's 28 objects. You can capture data at a very low level. You wouldn't necessarily use all of them, but I think thinking about where it lives will be dependent on your kind of tech stack. I think the critical piece that needs to come together is that there needs to be a single place where both of those reside, right? What you don't want to have is a place where we are capturing consent in a fundamentally different way in every system, and there's overlap that conflicts, because that's where it gets dangerous. Because typically, if I'm capturing marketing consent and I'm capturing patient consent, some of those questions are going to be the same. In what case do you want to hear from us? What constitutes legitimate interest versus, transactional emails? So there's a lot of definitions that get shared across those two functions. And so I think you want to be conscious of that when you're designing it and make sure that they are going to live in two places, that there isn't this crossover and therefore areas of kind of discrepancy. In an ideal world, you would have it live in one place, but for two very different functions. And you might have, back to our permissions conversation, you might have two very different sets of people looking at two very different sides of that coin, but the fundamental aspect of consent lives against the patient itself.
So would there be any kind of maybe a short red flag list, or what data must never be used in a marketing automation, for example?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's more just about understanding consent. I think where it sometimes gets dangerous is if you are capturing marketing consent here, and typically that marketing tool will only be looking at that level of consent. But let's just say on the patient side, the receptionist is capturing consent, the clinician is capturing consent, that all lives over here. And there's something in those forms that could be interpreted as marketing. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's where it gets really dangerous, because marketing isn't looking at any of this stuff. So as long as all of these other aspects of consent are so entirely separate to anything that we are doing from a marketing function, it's fine. But rarely is that the case. There'll be a checkbox or a question, something that could directly conflict with what we understand is our version of consent. And that's where it gets a bit dangerous. So I think just as a marketeer, being at least cognizant of where consent is captured through the life cycle of a patient, and making sure that wherever you can, you're reducing that duplication.
Mm. And while we're talking about pitfalls and problems with a CRM, what audit trail basics should be in place for maybe complaints or disputes?
Yeah. So, and again, this will be down to your platform. A lot of platforms will have this auditability inherent in them. So if I look at Salesforce as the example, every time somebody updates a record, it tells me exactly who the last modified was. I can do field level tracking on specific fields. So I can see if somebody has changed a date or a pick list value. I know exactly what it was before. I know who put that value in. I know what it's changed to, date and timestamp, and what user did that. So hopefully there's a lot of just inherent auditability, which you never know if you're going to need. But hopefully, it's there if you do need to fall back on it. I think in terms of the complaint side of things, again, this is one where oftentimes people will have these in a different system. And I think that kind of connectability and at least integration is really critical, because there will be a complaint about something, about marketing, about something that's happened, in the waiting area, about something that's happened in the course of an appointment. Having that be totally disconnected from all of those other functions and not have any flag, any visibility to that, kind of defeats the point of capturing that complaint. So thinking about how that integrates both technically, but into the process of how you feed that back, and how it doesn't just get dealt with as an isolated incident, but it gets fed back into a process improvement wherever that complaint kind of originated. So I think, again, back to that kind of holistic view of the patient and wanting to kind of better serve the patient, I think we need to not think about complaints management as a customer service function in isolation. I think we need to think about where it falls in this series of touch points and how we kind of integrate it into the full process, and not just deal with those and try to close them out as quickly as we can.
That makes a lot of sense. And now, kind of, I guess, bringing it all together, this is a big piece of work. There's a lot of things that we touched on here, and just if we're trying to sell it as clearly as possible, essentially, to a clinic owner that's maybe launching a new clinic and they're starting from scratch tomorrow, what would your maybe first 30 days of CRM activity look like for this clinic?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think it's all about design up front, right? Being purposeful with what we are going to capture, when we're going to capture it, how we're going to capture it, rather than diving straight in. Because I think that is the risk that a lot of people run, is as soon as you start talking about kind of features and functions, the technology is already leading you. So in this first 30 days, I would take a massive step back. I would evaluate what I want out of a CRM, the purpose behind collecting this data, what reporting and insights I'm going to get at the end of it. And then I would do this analysis to say, okay, what does that mean in terms of the systems that I need, the integrations that I need, so that before I embark on a CRM journey, I've got a bit of a view of that total cost of ownership, right? Because the purpose behind me implementing this technology might lead me down certain integration paths versus others, and just being conscious that, you know, it's probably going to be more than CRM, and having that viewpoint before I start building things that might then, you know, have been created unnecessarily.
From your experience though, like what would you, if a clinic owner is saying, well, why do I need a CRM system?
Yeah.
Like what are those maybe top 3 things that are possible that, you know, again, since these so many people, as I say, they're like, what's CRM? Like,
Yeah.
what would you say are the most kind of critical things that CRM can do for a clinic?
Yeah, I think the first is that 360-degree view of a patient, right? Really understanding every touch point, every activity, for which serves a multitude of purposes, right? It helps us understand, you know, how long it took us to get the lead in the door, how long it took us to convert, but it also helps us better serve that patient over time. So I think just the basic understanding of how we interact with our customers is really important. So first and foremost, I think the other piece is to be able to look at, and this is back to the reporting piece at the end, I think to be able to look at your business through the lens of true insights and trend analysis is so powerful, because I think typically on a day-to-day basis, we are asked to make so many decisions as business owners. And a lot of those people are doing by gut feel or doing by anecdotal feedback from the team, what's working, what's not working. You know, we all have a lot of sessions around give us feedback, but actually if you can look at the data and you've got a way to analyze that and interpret that, and it helps you make better educated decisions, I think that's infinitely powerful. And then I think also this downstream process of creating efficiency and trying to give people more time in their day back to better serve customers and patients, I think is really critical. I think when designed correctly, these systems can not only give you the data and the insight, but they can actually make people's lives easier. They can take away some of that admin burden. They can start to, be an enabler, and not just kind of a reporting function. So I would say those are the 3: is better serving your customer and having this 360-degree view, gaining insights about your business that you just wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have all of that data in one system. And then, you know, this third piece around automations and efficiency, and really trying to gain productivity through the use of a platform.
Yeah, and I guess for where we sit in marketing land, it would be kind of that middle bit. The data that we like to collect is that attribution of your marketing spend and it turning into actual patients.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100%. And so okay, we've launched our clinic and we've got the CRM kind of designed the way that we want it to capture those 3 major things. So at 90 days, what would you expect to be working reliably? Is it seamless? Should it be great all the way? Or are there going to be changes?
Yeah, good question. So I think back to that point around kind of post go live and having a process to evolve this, I would argue that especially in modern CRMs, right, most of them are going to be SaaS related. They will have updates, they will have releases. You're going to learn more about your business and therefore your use of CRM, that in that 90-day period, you should really start to be honing in on what's my BAU process, what's my center of excellence, have I really understood what the users need and created a mechanism to capture feedback. You should be getting into that cadence around release management and giving kind of more value add tools and creating people and process to do that. So the hope would be that, after you've launched, that you've got that kind of critical hypercare period. Then you've got this kind of bedding in period. And by the time you're at 90 days post-launch, we should be thinking about, okay, how do we keep this thing running? How do we keep the momentum? How do we keep continuing to collect feedback and evolving this over time?
Amazing. And then I guess So now, okay, what if we're 120 days in and you're kind of presenting the CRM success to the clinic owner? What would you say is kind of the single metric that you'd present to that owner to kind of prove the CRM is absolutely delivering value?
Yeah, it's a good question. Everybody's going to be different. Everybody will have a reason that they've purchased this thing. And it will depend typically on people's maturity in terms of where their clinic is. So is it a startup where it's all about acquisition and it's all about, how much kind of volume can I push through this marketing funnel and therefore convert? And then it's probably about, demand generation metrics and conversion metrics. If I'm a more mature clinic and I'm not looking for new customers, I've kind of, I'm trying to turn customers away. I'm looking at lifetime value. I'm looking at what are my customer sat scores, and am I improving the patient experience? So I think it kind of depends on why you bought it, why it was implemented, and where you are in that maturity life cycle. But I do think you're right, Taylor, that you should have a headline metric, because that's what makes it easy to communicate to the wider business around what the purpose and the vision of having a CRM is. If you can kind of have a guiding light or a guiding metric, people, that becomes really clear to people, right? And so I think being clear with what you want to achieve out of this, is really important.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place for us to stop. We've gone deep. I think we've covered so much about CRM, and thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to have such a clear expert in CRM to be a part of this project. So thank you so much, Vera.
No, thank you. I've loved it. It's been a great conversation.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, and please join us next time for more insights.